Okay, so we are live. Welcome, everyone. It's nice to see everybody. This is a beautiful Sunday. If you can correct me, it's Sunday, February 20th, and it's 11 a.m. We are in Clearwater, or we're zooming in from elsewhere. Welcome. So I want to introduce our very important subject today and our three speakers. We don't have one today, we have three, and it's going to be a very good discussion because we have apparently the world's expert on Roy Wilhelm here today with us, Joel. But before I get to introductions, let me first say the topic. You know what, Jeremiah? I don't have the topic in front of me, so I'm going to pull it up right now. Sorry, everybody. So, of course, it's Roy Wilhelm. That's a topic, but I want to get specific. It's Hand of the Cause of God, Roy Wilhelm, for Bahá'ís. Roy Cochran Wilhelm, born September 17, 1875 until December 20th, 1951, was a prominent early American Bahá'í who was posthumously appointed a Hand of the Cause of God by Shoghi Effendi. He was a millionaire businessman in New York City and head of the family coffee company. His mother, Laurie, became a Bahá'í in 1898. But Roy was not attracted to the faith until he accompanied his mother on her pilgrimage to Akká in 1907. This experience transformed his life. He was elected to serve on the executive board of the Bahá'í Temple Unity in 1909. And except for 1 year of illness, remained a member on it and its successor, the National Spiritual Assembly, until 1946, often acting as its treasurer. He also helped administer the Baha'i community in New York, produced Baha'i literature, and supported the teaching work of Martha Root and Louis Gregory. He acted as a channel of communication between Abdu'l-Bahá and the American Bahá'ís, and was one of those whom Shoghi Effendi consulted about the future development of the faith in 1922. He died on November 24th, 1951, and was posthumously named a Hand of the Cause by Shoghi Effendi. An annual Unity Feast is held at the former Wilhelm property at West Englewood, New Jersey, to commemorate a feast held there by Abdu'l-Baha during his visit to America. How beautiful. So we have three speakers, as I just had previously alluded to, and I would like to start by first introducing our very own from the local area in Tampa Bay, Catherine Jewett Hoganson. She is a lawyer, historian, and speaker who has served both at the World Center of the Baha'i Faith and for the National Spiritual Assembly of the United States. She is a graduate of Emory and Henry College and the University of Virginia School of Law. Her most recent book is Infinite Horizons, The Life and Times of Horace Holly, due out in late February. She is working on a biography of Roy Wilhelm, and she's also married to our other speaker, Gary Hoganson. She is a mother and grandmother and lives in Tarpon Springs, Florida. Now on to our next speaker, Gary Hoganson. He is originally from Michigan. He has worked in manufacturing and finance, and he is a graduate of California State University, East Bay, and the American Graduate School of International Management. He pioneered for many years in Latin America and served 18 years at the Baha'i World Center in Haifa, Israel. A lifelong student of history, he has been developing his skills as a writer in retirement. He lives in Tarpon Springs, Florida, with his wife, Kathy, and they have 2 daughters and 3 grandchildren. Now, I am going to introduce our expert here on Roy Wilhelm, Dr. Joel Nissen. And sorry, Joel, if I'm saying your name incorrectly, please correct me. Is that correct?
Nissen.
Nissen, thank you. Sorry about that. Dr.
Okay.
Joel Nissen, MD, FACS, FASCRS, is a double-boarded colon surgeon in practice since 1984 with a number of scientific publications. Married to Vicky Renee Neisen for 42 years, with 2 daughters and 5 grandchildren, served in many capacities during the Second World Congress, including Quad State Committee, Regional Volunteer Coordinator, Medical Task Force, and Dignitary Transport Task Force. As part of Health for Humanity in the 1990s, the entire family traveled to Guyana, South America, 6 times to perform surgery, teach at the medical school, and help establish a hospital in Lethem, Rupununi, Guyana. Did I say that correctly?
Rupununi, Guyana. Yes, you were good.
Rupununi, Guyana. Thank you very much. He has been a continuous member of the Regional Bahá'í Council for the Northeastern states since 1997, serving alternately as secretary, chair, and treasurer. Delegate from Northern New Jersey to the annual Bahá'í National Convention since 1990, and he's a facilitator of youth academics at Greenacre Bahá'í School, including Badasht Prep, and Turning 15. He is editor of Wings of the Spirit, a statewide newsletter for the New Jersey District Teaching Committee for 10 years. And over several years, 6 different youth were invited to live in the Neisen household and were formally sponsored to attend the local high school. That being said, I've introduced 3 amazing people. I want to point out that I've actually been able to meet Mr. Neisen's family here in Florida. It's very, very amazing where he's speaking today, and just fortuitously I get to meet his daughter and his son-in-law. It's amazing. What a wonderful family. So with that being said, I don't know who's speaking first, but I give the floor to all of you.
Thank you so much. I very much appreciate that, John. This is the first time that the 3 of us have been trying to present an overview of the life of Roy Wilhelm together. For the last 6 months, we've been working as a team to try to take Joel's amazing research into the life of Roy Wilhelm. And frankly, I've never seen anyone do as extensive research on a topic as Joel was able to do. I think it's the scientist in him. To take it and turn it into a live story. So we hope that within the next week or so, it will be at the U.S. Baha'i Publishing Trust, and they are very committed to getting this book out. So hopefully by this summer, the biography of Roy Wilhelm will be available for purchase. Yay. So anyway, it's been a wonderful experience working as a team, and this is their first experience trying to summarize this amazing life. So I want to begin by first sharing, we're going to have this. All right, are you now seeing the screen?
I don't personally see it. Does anyone else? And
okay, so let me try again. Oh, okay. All right, now.
Okay, it's starting. Okay, now I see it.
All right. So, Roy Wilhelm. He is a very difficult hand of the cause to put in a box. We know many things about particularly the Western hands of the cause. Some of us actually remember a number of them. And many of them have sort of one theme to their service, whether it's teaching, administration. You think of John Robart, you think about the power of prayer. Some of them, like Martha Root, who was this incredible teacher, went around the world. We'll talk about her in a minute. But Roy is multifaceted. I think we don't know much about him because he was a very quiet kind of a person. He had a wonderful folksy sense of humor. So he was always a delight to be with, but he was very quiet, a very gentle sort of soul. And the thing is, he did it all. He was very involved in the teaching work, including creating some of the first Baha'i pamphlets for seekers and other Baha'i literature for seekers and new believers. He supported teachers, but he also was traveling for business and would travel all over the United States and meet with Baha'is and talk about the faith to anyone he met. So he himself was a great teacher. He also was involved in the early days of Baha'i administration and had a profound impact on the administrative order. He was used as the eyes and ears of Abdu'l-Bahá and then Shoghi Effendi to find out what was going on in North America. He was the master's postman, and again, the postman for the Guardian. Almost all communications from the World Center went through his office in New York. And he was very much involved with the development of the World Center. And he was very involved with the protection of the faith as a big proponent of the will and testament of Abdu'l-Bahá. We'll talk briefly about all these things, but he is this gentle, quiet giant, spiritual titan in the background. You want to move it on? Next slide. Yes. Okay, let me do it. I'm gonna try to figure out this. Many of us, when we think of the Hands of the Cause, we think of this group. This is the ones who were appointed from 1951 on. And the one thing that I think the three of us would change in that introduction is it had the date of his death wrong. He didn't die in November. He died in December of 1951. About a week before the Guardian sent out his letters to the Baha'i world, appointing his first contingent of living Hands of the Cause, the first living ones since the time of Baha'u'llah. And so Roy is the very last Hand of the Cause to be appointed after his passing. But as you will see, he carried out all of the duties that we think of with a Hand of the Cause, of Hands of the Cause. The primary duties, of course, being promoting the teaching work and the protection work of the faith, edifying the souls of men and so forth. That he carried out these duties while he didn't know that he was a Hand of the Cause. The foremost Hand of the Cause, according to Shoghi Effendi, the one he designated as the foremost Hand of the Cause, was, of course, Martha Root. And Martha encircled the globe 4 times to teach the faith, to spread it everywhere she could possibly go. Roy was the one who introduced her to the faith. He became her little brother. They were very, very close. And so when she began her international travels, he was her safety net. And as someone who knew how to move money around the world and had this center of his office near Wall Street in New York, he several times was invaluable to helping her out when she was in difficulties as part of her teaching work. They stayed very close to the end of her life. She passed away before he did in 1939. He was the executor of her estate, and like I said, she is really like a sister to Roy Wilhelm. In fact, she often said that she considered Roy's parents to be her second set of parents. So there was a very close relationship. And no Roy Wilhelm, no Martha Root, because he's the one that introduced her. And we won't get into that story right now. It's in the book. It's also in the Martha Root book. But it's a wonderful story of how he introduced her to the faith. Roy was a Midwesterner from Zanesville, Ohio. His family on both sides had been some of the early English or American settlers, white settlers to that part of Ohio. And he was very proud of his pioneer roots. His father was unusual, Otis Wilhelm, because he actually had a university degree at a time when that was quite odd or unique. And his mother, Laurie, was from good working stock there and came from a very religious background. His mother and grandmother were both very religious, but also religious in the sense that they both expected the return of Christ and were looking for him. So Roy was not the student his father was, and he took off in high school. He ran away from home once. His parents found him and they brought him back, and he decided he didn't want to stay in high school, so he ran away again and started a career as a traveling salesman. And during this period, his mother, who had raised Roy in the Presbyterian church, started on her own spiritual quest in more earnestness, along with a friend who was a neighbor. And this friend moved to the Chicago area, and there the friend encountered the Baha'i faith and went to Ibrahim Kerala's classes. You will remember that Ibrahim Kerala was the man who essentially brought the Baha'i faith to the United States in terms of the first real teacher of the faith in the United States. And she wrote to Laurie and said, our quest is over. I've found what we've been looking for, sent her some Baha'i literature, and Laurie immediately was attracted to it. She sent this literature on to her son, Roy, who was not at that time living with his parents. And he sort of looked it over and wrote back and said, curious if true, but sort of dismissed it. So Roy's path in life showed that he was a very adventurous fellow. And I'm now going to turn, this is young Roy, very handsome young man, medium height, dark hair, dark eyes. And here he is with his parents, Otis and Laurie. He didn't run away because he didn't like his parents. He got along very well with his parents. They were actually very close. So we're not exactly sure why he ran away, except perhaps because he didn't like school. So I'm going to turn it over now to Gary.
Okay, well, I think he ran away because he just was curious about the world, and he had a sense of adventure. I think you're going to like this book, and especially if you love to read novels, because his story reads like a novel. And I was trying to think of some of the attributes that define him, and the list keeps going on and on and on. You know, that Kathy's already alluded to his curiosity, to his adventureness, and he was extremely generous, and he had a great deal of integrity and trustworthiness, and above all, he was a modest person. So how do we find this young 20-something-year-old actually started as a teenager, selling pottery that was manufactured there in Zanesville, Ohio, going around the country, calling on retailers to buy this. So he's already started a career of reaching out. Any of you who have been involved in the process of selling knows it takes a tremendous amount of will and courage to knock on doors, to keep going. It's a whole process of persistence, rejection, going back, hitting the next door. It's exactly what we're involved in teaching the faith, and have always been. We have to be brave and keep knocking on the doors. Looking at this, the slide here, you see a man in a chariot with a whip and 4 horses. This is actually a label from a coffee can for the Victor coffee brand, the Shapely Coffee Company in Boston, Massachusetts. Roy went to work as a salesman for them, and they had a train car. They carried 5 horses, 5 gray horses in that train car, this chariot, a buggy, and plus the people involved. And they would go from town to town. They stop, and they would harnessed these 4 horses to the chariot. There was an African-American man who rode that chariot, and blowing a trumpet through the streets. And you can imagine what the circus event going through to introduce this Victor coffee to a small town or city. And Roy is right there behind them. He's in the in a horse and buggy going from store to retailer to encourage people. I mean, this is a very interesting little side bit, but this is how he gets a start in the end of the 19th century. And I think he, as I said, he started sipping the coffee, because the next thing we know, Roy is on a ship heading to Costa Rica. And he ends up in Costa Rica and buys a small coffee farm. We haven't identified the exact location of it, but there's enough evidence to put him and place him in Costa Rica at the end of the 20th century, end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century. And this is where he's going to continue to groom his understanding of what will ultimately become his lifelong profession or vocation. So he's now involved in the planting and growing of coffee, the harvesting, what takes and when is it determining the quality of a coffee bean, and how is it prepared and cleaned and dried and bagged for export. So he now has this kind of insider knowledge of one aspect of the business. And so he takes that knowledge and goes back to the US, and he partners with a man by the name of Gregory in Boston, who is a green coffee importer and seller. And Roy partners with him and opens up a New York office. So, he's already gone through this effort of learning about coffee. He's been exposed to a new culture, new languages. And now he has a New York Wall Street address to begin his career as a coffee broker. And Kathy alluded to earlier, this office became important for the faith, for Shoghi Effendi, for Abdu'l-Baha, because it became the point of contact for messages going back and forth between the Holy Land, because Roy had, he had this cable telegraph system in his office. He was used to sending payments overseas, so he knew how to move money around the world. So this became a valuable center for his business and his and for the faith. It's interesting because he was this was his own business, so he defined how he would use his time, and he had unstructured time. He was also traveling, so he was going from coast to coast, selling his wares, but he also took advantage of that to tell anyone who for a moment would stop and listen. He gave talks in various places about the faith, and but as a grower and now broker, he was also the others in the profession turned to Roy because of his integrity, and they trusted him. He became an expert. He had this tremendous sense of quality, of being able to taste the coffee and determine the value where it came from and the quality of it, and grading. He was used for settling disputes and helping to set standards in this new business. So, anyway, I think we probably should move on. But before. This is him involved in his business and how he used this business to serve the faith. But how did he become a Baha'i? How did that happen?
I'm glad you asked. He actually showed some interest in the faith before 1907, but it was in the beginning because he was humoring his mother. He would go with her to some New York meetings when she and his father would come and visit him in Manhattan. And so he started attending the Baha'i meetings to take his mother, and he found himself drawn into them. The first meeting he went to, he had Edward Getzinger and May Maxwell were there, some wonderful prominent Baha'is. So he was able to very quickly become interested through that, but he wasn't interested in committing. Surprisingly, most Baha'is, when they became Baha'is in those early days, the first thing they did was write to Abdu'l-Baha. That was sort of your way of declaring your faith. He didn't do that. Abdu'l-Baha wrote to him, not once, but several times, I think trying to get Roy's attention. He'd, I think, heard about Roy through other people, but he didn't wait for Roy. And in 1905, his father, Otis, decided he wanted to go on a pilgrimage to the Holy Land and wrote to Abdu'l-Baha for permission. Abdu'l-Baha wrote back and said, "It wouldn't be wise for you to come, but your son Roy can come." Well, Roy still didn't take the hint. So God sort of knocked him over the head. One day, Roy is sitting in his Manhattan apartment in the Morningside Heights neighborhood, and is changing his shoes. And all of a sudden, his room changes. Rather than the normal walls and his furniture, suddenly there's whitewashed, plastered walls. There's a divan. It was clear to him he was suddenly thrust into a place in the Orient. He had no idea what was going on. And there was a man present. This man was in long Oriental robes and had a long beard, dark beard. And he came up to Roy and took a ring off of his finger and put it on Roy's hand. And then he took a ring off of Roy's finger and placed it on his own hand. And then the vision disappeared. Now, Roy had been around plenty of mystical, eccentric Baha'is. He thought they might be very interested in this, but he also knew that most people would think he was nuts if he told them about this experience. So he kept it to himself. A year or so later, we don't know exactly when that vision occurred, but within a year or so, his mother decided she would go on pilgrimage, and he agreed to make that possible and to accompany her. So he went with his mother, and here is the front of Abdullah Pasha, where they stayed as guest of Abdu'l-Baha. They had a wonderful week or so in the Holy Land. Here's the famous stairway that went up to the apartments of Abdu'l-Baha. This is the early picture of it from 1898 from Edward Getzinger. This is a group that came a year or two after the Wilhelms were there. Roy, who loved taking pictures, for some reason didn't take any while he was a pilgrim. But the last place that he and his mother visited as part of their pilgrimage was the Rizwan Garden. They had just been to Baji for the first and only time. And then from there, they were taken to the Rizwan Garden, where they had some food and had a chance to enjoy this wonderful place. Then they were invited to come to the little house at the end of the garden. And I'm sure many of you that I see on the screen have been to the Rizwan Garden, and you're quite familiar with this building at the end of it, which is where there was a room that Baha'u'llah, when he would come to the garden, would stay, sometimes overnight. As soon as Roy went into that room, and this is a picture of how it looks now, he immediately recognized it as the place that he had the vision of. He later shared the vision with Abdu'l-Bahá and was told that that was Baha'u'llah who had come to him, and that by the exchange of rings, Baha'u'llah had wedded him to himself. From that moment on, he went from someone who was starting to have faith to someone who had certitude. And you can see this in the letters Abdu'l-Bahá sent him before and after the pilgrimage. In the before the pilgrimage, he writes to him as though he's a seeker. After the pilgrimage, he writes to him as a very firm Baha'i. So I'm going to turn it back to Gary now for a minute or two.
All right. So it was very timely in terms of Roy's entry into the coffee business, because it was basically a business that skyrocketed at the beginning of the 20th century, right up until today. So he was in a growth industry, and this, of course, led to his wealth and subsequently to his generosity of all the many things that he helped the faith with, in terms of simple things like he sent a note to Abdu'l-Bahá and said, you know, we can electrify the shrine and light it up if you would like, and we can send a generator. Abdu'l-Bahá said, that's a great idea, send 3.
Said 4.
Send 4, right. And so anyway, the generators were sent and installed. Roy made sure that the Guardian had a dignified car to drive around and get around Haifa with. He helped with the acquisition of strategic properties in the Holy Land, and he even sent pen nibs. I mean, everything and anything that the Guardian or Abdu'l-Bahá needed, he was there to help. And he basically used this wealth that he created through this business in the advancement of the faith. But he was living in Manhattan, but this is a country boy. He loved the rural. And so he ended up buying with his dad some lots in New Jersey, which was, forest and farmland. But there was a large estate that was being subdivided into building lots. And as I said, he and his dad bought several of these, and it was time to build a house for his mom and dad and for himself. And in what is now the Teaneck, New Jersey. And as it will happen, that one of the people, a couple that he was involved in teaching the faith, was also had bought a lot and built a house in the same neighborhood. And this was a French-Canadian man and his wife. This is Louis Bourgeois, basically an artist who became an architect. And of course, you all know Louis Bourgeois. And when he got done designing Roy a house, went on to design the house of worship in Wilmette. So anyway, the Wilhelms and the Bourgeois lived, a block apart in this Teaneck neighborhood. Once we go on here. This is the house that, it's a front view of the house that was taken just last year. And of course, seeing Bourgeois' design, modest house, plenty of room for the family, and they took river rocks and built the decorative columns with that. And, you know, when this property is fairly large. There's several, I think it was like 13 or 14 lots that ultimately were purchased. And that property was eventually given to the National Bahá'í National Assembly, National Spiritual Assembly, and is maintained today as a retreat. There's a log cabin on the property, which maybe have a time to talk about. But one of the things that, if you've been to Teaneck and gone to the picnics or anything like that, you may have parked your car on this tennis court. My understanding is that the tennis court is, the parking lot is now where this tennis court. And we have evidence that Roy's father, right up until the end, was a very active user of this tennis court. And anyway, I think that's enough. Yeah.
All right. So we're going to now turn it over to Joel, who's going to talk about another extremely important period of Roy's life, which is 1912 and the Abdu'l-Baha's visit to the United States.
Hi there.
Yeah.
So I became interested in studying Roy Wilhelm when we lived in New Jersey early on and started to go to the annual souvenir picnic, which is an event held the last Saturday of June since 1912. And that's the topic I'll talk about briefly. Prior to Abdu'l-Baha's visit in 1912, after he had been released from being a prisoner for many years and recovering his health in Egypt, Roy wrote him a letter indicating that he was offering his house as a place to come, and he sent a sum of $1,000. This is $1912,000 to help defray the costs of Abdu'l-Baha's travels. Abdu'l-Baha very graciously said, "Thank you for the gift. I'm returning it so that you may spend it in my name in good works for humanity." Abdu'l-Baha, while in America, had an extremely busy schedule. He would meet with people from morning till night. Oftentimes people would come unannounced. There would be waiting lines. He had a large number of appointments. And by the summertime, it was very hot in this part of the world. And Abdu'l-Baha, perhaps because of that summer heat wave, wanted to take a few days off from his hectic activities and spend a little bit of time in the country. So he went and he said, "I'm to leave the city for a few days to rest in Montclair. When I return, it is my wish to give a large feast of unity. A place for it has not yet been found. It must be outdoors under the trees, in a location away from city noise, like a Persian garden. The food will be Persian food. When the place is arranged, all will be informed." Roy and his parents had lived in Teaneck since 1908. They actually stayed in the bourgeois' house for several months while that stucco house was being built. And starting in 1908, they began to invite people for picnics to their property, sometimes having more than 100 people at their house. By ferry to pick them up and bring them to their property, because transportation at that time was not wonderful. So it was decided that the Teaneck property, Roy Wilhelm's property, would be the ideal place to have this celebration. And here's a picture of one of the original invitations for that activity. Abdu'l-Baha specified that they should not spend more than $100 on all the arrangements, but I suspect they did spend much more than that. There was food prepared in Manhattan at the Kinney's house, and it was Persian chicken and rice, and they transported it in galvanized tin trash cans, clean cans. They were not used, they were very clean, but there was so much food they had to transport them in these garbage cans to bring them to the property. Roy spent a certain amount of time preparing the property for the picnic. He had one of his neighbors, a Mr. McGee, help clear away underbrush and all the poison ivy. Another neighbor, Herman Pauley, set up flags from all nations to make it look a little bit more festive. And Abdu'l-Baha, and you see the picture here with his entourage, with two hands of the cause, Louis Getzinger and Martha Root and all these little children at the picnic, had to take 4 trains to go from Montclair, where he was staying, to get to Roy's house. They had to actually travel back into Manhattan and then back again into New Jersey. When he arrived, he was surrounded by children who were eager to see him. And he rested for a few minutes and then spent the rest of the day with all the guests. And there are several pictures of the assembled guests. There are estimates between 200 and 350 guests, although they weren't all there at one time. And you can see here all the ladies in their bedizened finery. This was a very unique event because normally in 1912, people did not associate with people other than their own type. And here there are rich, poor, black, white, factory workers, different religions, immigrants. The amount of diversity in this picnic is amazing when you actually look at who was present. There were people from Maine, from California, and it was an event unique in US history at this time because of the diversity involved, and everybody was getting along. Lunch was served in part of the property which Roy and his father did not own. They were actually squatting in part of the Phelps estate. And Abdu'l-Baha personally anointed each person present with Rose of Atar during that luncheon. He gave 4 talks during the time, 2 of which have been recorded. The rest are lost to posterity unless they show up at some point. And he talked about unity. And to quote just one of them, "You must look beyond material interests towards attaining the virtues of God. You are charged to uplift the cause of unity among the nations of the earth." He desired for those listening to his words to understand the importance of their spiritual nature. But a number of people wrote descriptions of the picnic, and there's one from Julia Thompson, which is very poetic, which is in the evening. And just to read briefly, "To me, the most beautiful scene of all came later, when the master returned to us after dark. 50 or 60 people had lingered, unable to tear themselves from him. The master sat in a chair on the top steps of the porch, some of us surrounding him. Below us, all over the lawn, on each side of the path, sat the others, the light summer skirts of the women spread out on the grass, tapers in their hands to keep off mosquitoes. In the dark, in their filmy dresses, they looked like great moths, and the burning tips of the tapers they waved like fireflies darting about." Very poetic description of the evening part. Abdu'l-Baha stayed in Roy's house that night, slept there. Here's a picture of some of the guests on the Roy's house. And you can see here's Varga, who was a hand of the cause, a trustee of Hukuk-Allah, the Kinneys, Louis Getzinger, who's in her bright blue dress, although in this black and white picture, it looks gray, but it's bright blue. And in the morning, Abdu'l-Baha woke up very early and went and sat in Roy's car, probably before 6 o'clock in the morning. And one of the translators told Roy that Abdu'l-Baha was ready to go. Roy, a little bit confused, says, "Where does he want to go at 6 in the morning?" And he said he had met a minister the day before during the picnic. And here's the car that Roy owned, a 1911 Touring Rio. And Abdu'l-Baha wanted to finish a conversation he had started with the Reverend. So Roy said, "Who was it?" And they didn't know the person's name. So Roy had to knock on some of his neighbors' windows and doors to find out the name of the person, who was a Reverend Grulich, who lived in Dumont, but no one knew the address. So Roy, a little bit after 6 a.m, in this car with Abdu'l-Bahá and a few others, drove to Dumont down the main street and saw someone running after them in his bathrobe with shaving cream on half of his face. This was the minister who saw the car coming down the street and realized it had to be Abdu'l-Bahá coming to see him. So they finished their conversation, which took about 90 seconds. And then Abdu'l-Bahá and Roy continued on to Montclair, where Abdu'l-Bahá was then a guest of an ambassador, Mr. Topkapian. So there are many, many stories of Roy Wilhelm. Here I had the pleasure of hosting our fellow invitees to the property. And here's the spot. This plaster model is a replica of one of the columns of the Universal House of Justice, and it marks the spot where we believe Abdu'l-Bahá anointed everyone with Rose of Attar. In 1933, a group of people who were at the original picnic testified that this was the spot. So I turn this back over to my fellow conspirators, having shared just one story of Roy Wilhelm.
Thank you. Of course, we've quickly flipped through some pictures of the later picnics, because a year later, Roy held, after Abdu'l-Bahá had left the United States, he held another picnic to commemorate the one held the year before. And Abdu'l-Bahá wrote back and said that was wonderful and that it should be an annual souvenir of his journey to the West. And so there are only two things that Abdu'l-Bahá designated should be held annually in the United States. One is the souvenir picnic, which is to commemorate his visit to North America. And the other is an annual pilgrimage to the resting site of Thornton Chase in Englewood, California. So one is in West Englewood on the East Coast, and then we have Englewood on the West Coast. And those are two annual events ordained by Abdu'l-Bahá. So the Wilhelm property was turned over to the National Assembly by Roy so that this annual event could continue into perpetuity. And I know some of the people on the screen have been fortunate enough to attend. So we want to talk briefly about a few other aspects to Roy. First of all, his administrative contributions. In 1909, a group of representatives from around the country met at the home of Corinne True in Chicago. She was a wealthy housewife. Her husband was president of the World Book Encyclopedia. And there they established the Bahá'í Temple Unity, which became the organization to try to raise up a house of worship for North America at the request of Abdu'l-Bahá. They set up an executive board at that meeting and elected the executive board. Interestingly, Roy was not present at that meeting, even though he was designated through telegrams because they needed someone from New York. He was designated their person. And so, but he was not elected actually at the meeting, but during the course of the year, he became a member of the executive board. For many years, from 1909 until 1922, the executive board of Bahá'í Temple Unity served essentially the function of the National Spiritual Assembly. It was the only representative board of Baha'is from throughout the United States and Canada. It didn't have a mandate to do all the things that the National Assembly does today. And its primary function was, of course, to raise money to build the house of worship and to start acquiring land and other things. So it had to be incorporated, and a number of other practical matters had to be dealt with by that board. And Roy was on it from some point in 1909, early 1910, until it became the National Spiritual Assembly of the Baha'is of the United States. And there's questions about whether that happens in 1922 or in 1925. That's a whole nother story we're not going to get into, but he was all this time serving on whatever national governing body we had. Roy was on it. And of course, his understanding of finance and business and his practical streak, as well as his integrity, were extremely helpful as they started getting involved in building the house of worship. The other major focus of Temple Unity was Baha'i publications, because we had almost no literature in English. This was a very big issue for Roy. He became involved in Baha'i publishing first through creating two little pamphlets, which he called Big Ben and Little Ben, which were basically small compilations of the writings geared to seekers. And he made them really, he had them printed in huge quantities and made them available for purchase to the friends at very cut rates. Through working with printers, he learned a lot about the printing and publishing business and producing these wonderful little booklets. And he was also very involved in the publication of new translations and other works that were geared to either educating the Baha'i community or making it the faith known to seekers and non-Baha'is. So he was very active with this. When Abdu'l-Bahá passed away in late November 1921, there was a big gap, and Roy's office in Manhattan became sort of continued to be the center for communication. So he's the one who first gets the cable that he's passed away, and then he's the one sitting there anxiously waiting for the next cable to explain what was going to happen next, who would be the new head of the faith. Finally, in January, a cable is sent from the Greatest Holy Leave announcing that Shoghi Effendi was now the head of the faith and the guardian of the faith, a new station, a new office that was created in the Will and Testament. In January, Shoghi Effendi invited Roy and Montford Mills to come to Haifa for consultation. They arrived there toward the end of February, and he had invited two from England, two from France, two from Germany, two from the US, two from Iran, and then Rumi, the hand of the cause, Rumi, who was at that time living in Burma. The purpose of the consultation was to decide whether or not to immediately set about to elect the Universal House of Justice. There were many people who felt that that was the best thing. Shoghi Effendi was 24 years old. He was a graduate student, untried. People didn't know much about him, and in fact, even the British, who at that point had taken over control of the Holy Land, were urging Shoghi Effendi to go ahead and elect the House of Justice so there would be a governing council in the absence of Abdu'l-Bahá. But when the consultations occurred behind closed doors, it became clear to everyone that they weren't ready to elect a House of Justice. There weren't even national spiritual assemblies to do the electing. So he spent almost a month or so, or a number of weeks there in the Holy Land with Shoghi Effendi. He had a number of talks with Shoghi Effendi, both privately and as part of the groups. And Shoghi Effendi began to unfold for these handpicked representatives the importance of the administrative order, the vision of it. And he wrote a wonderful letter, March the 5th letter, about the basics of Baha'i administration that was then sent to the North American community. And he went over that letter with these representatives to explain it. He also spent a great deal of time with them talking about the Will and Testament and showing them the original and having them authenticated in his presence, because they all recognized Abdu'l-Bahá's handwriting and his seals. They had seen many of these. So this was very important. And he and the lawyer from New York, Munford Mills, who was a buddy of Roy's, were the two North American representatives for this very important consultation in the Holy Land. They are sent back to their home countries with instructions to see that national spiritual assemblies were elected in short order. And this is some of the people who came together in Chicago. They went to visit the site of the House of Worship, which Foundation Hall was under construction at that time. So this is part of the group that elected the first National Spiritual Assembly of the Baha'is of the United States. Now, the Guardian didn't give that NSA the full recognition as an NSA until 1925. But nonetheless, the 1922 convention, which Roy was a big part of that convention, was very important. Over the years, he continued to serve from 1922 on the National Spiritual Assembly. And because at that time they didn't have the national office in Chicago, or the Wilmette area, most of the meetings were held on the East Coast. It was where the majority of the members lived, on the East Coast. And here we see the 1932 meeting of the National Assembly on Roy's property. And in the middle is his mother and Martha Root. Martha was not on the National Assembly, but was there that day. Here he is later serving with this illustrious group during World War II. And you see that of this group, all but 3 of them would go on to be named Hands of the Cause. And George Latimer over here, who was named a disciple of Abdu'l-Bahá, Dorothy Baker, a hand, Amelia Collins, a hand, Alan McDaniel. He was not named anything special, but he was a civil engineer, a professor of engineering, and he was vital to the construction of the House of Worship as the liaison with the contractors. We have Hand of the Cause Horace Holly, who was the NSA secretary, Roy Wilhelm, who was the NSA treasurer, of course, Louis Gregory, our intrepid teacher and amazing Hand of the Cause, Leroy Ioas, another Hand of the Cause. And this is, I believe, Philip Sprague. Roy, during his years on the National Assembly, did many quiet things that affected the establishment of policies and the way that the institution functioned. He was part of the National Assembly when it developed the Declaration of Trust, the Constitution of the National Assembly, which is used by all National Assemblies worldwide. He also had a lot to do with the development of the Treasury, the way we keep money, and understood at a very deep level the importance of the fund and the sacrificial nature of contributions to the fund. And so therefore the fund had to be very carefully maintained and not wasted in any way. In his last years, he built a second home in Maine on the side of a mountain, which is another wonderful story that we're not going to get into. In 1945, he was diagnosed with colon cancer. And so he had to resign from the National Assembly. He'd been in poor health actually for some years, but the Guardian had urged him to stay on despite his health issues. But in 1945, the Guardian reluctantly agreed. And he spent the last years of his life at his main home because at that point, the New Jersey property was being used by the faith and was owned by the National Assembly. And this is the wonderful cable that was sent by Shoghi Effendi, which is on his gravestone. It says, his distinguished career enriched the annals of the concluding years of the heroic and the opening years of the formative age of the faith. His sterling qualities endeared him to his beloved master, Abdu'l-Bahá. His saintliness, indomitable faith, outstanding services, local, national, and international, his exemplary devotion qualify him to join the ranks of the Hands of the Cause and ensure him an everlasting reward in the Abha kingdom. a few weeks or a few months after that, he left the bulk of his estate to Shoghi Effendi. And when it was his estate, his business was finally liquidated, Shoghi Effendi used it to purchase, I think, about 25 acres surrounding the property at the Shrine of the Bab, strategic property we needed for the Shrine of the Bab. And he sent a wonderful cable to the world announcing that this had been purchased, this important land had been purchased, and that it was the last gift, essentially, of Hand of the Cause, Roy Wilhelm. So, dear friends, I don't know whether there's, John, whether questions and answers are allowed. We are at the magic moment of noon, or now a little bit past it. But certainly I'm willing to stick around, and I'm sure Joel is too, if there's any questions.
And you realize that there are many, many more stories and facts that we have not included in this 1 hour talk. It is impossible to encompass all of Roy Wilhelm in this short time. This is just a small taste of what we know.
That means buy the book.
Yeah.
So I have a question for you about the legacy of Roy Wilhelm. So we know that he was posthumously made Hand of the Cause, and during his life, he was not Hand of the Cause. Not that he knew he was, people didn't know he was. What other than that is his legacy in terms of the Baha'i community? And of course, we've heard about this event that occurs. What is that property again?
The souvenir picnic, which has happened every year except for 2 since 1912, is in Teaneck, New Jersey, in Bergen County. It's the last Saturday, and it's actually for the Feast of Ramat. It's that's why it's called the Feast of Abdu'l-Bahá. It's the Feast of Ramat. But Roy is known not just for the picnic, but for his administrative work, establishment of the Treasury, the inception of the Publishing Trust. He is a servant of Abdu'l-Bahá and Shoghi Effendi. He served them in so many different ways. Primarily, the American public doesn't really know about him that much because he served so many ways in a quiet manner. But for instance, all the messages from Abdu'l-Bahá and Shoghi Effendi to the United States came through his 104 Wall Street office. Some of them would not have addresses, would not have names. And Roy would have to figure out who this cable was supposed to go to, and then he'd have to forward it to them. So you can imagine the wealth of mail that he had to deal with. But in addition, he dealt with covenant breakers. And even though he was not named as a Hand of the Cause, he was such a trusted servant to the faith that he was asked multiple times, and again, there are many instances in the book where you see him dealing with examples of covenant breaking in the faith.
And Shoghi Effendi makes it clear, and so does Abdu'l-Bahá, but particularly Shoghi Effendi, that he trusts Roy's judgment. So there are many times where Roy sends his own reports. He writes to Shoghi Effendi all the time. He sends him newspaper clippings from the New York Times so the Guardian would stay up with what's happening in world events and so forth. But he says, you are essential to me. One reason he didn't want him resigning from the National Assembly was he knew he would get reports of what was happening on the National Assembly and in the American Bahá'í community that were sound and not biased in any way. And so he was really the Guardian's eyes and ears, and he was Abdu'l-Bahá's eyes and ears.
And it's interesting, Kathy and I were both granted the privilege of reading the minutes of the Bahá'í Temple Unity and the National Spiritual Assembly up to 1946, which, as far as I know, no one else was granted. So we know a lot of personal information that we did not put in the book because it is really private information.
It's very intriguing. So you mentioned a lot of important concepts here. And one of them was the trustworthiness of Roy Wilhelm. Now, I know this is a huge topic for Baha'is in general, the subject of integrity. And I'm hoping you could unpack this a little bit for us here, because there's so much can be said about this subject, about integrity. If you could please delve in just short intro into what the Baha'i stance is on integrity, what Baha'is are supposed to do, and how Roy Wilhelm tried to meet that goal, that aim in his life.
Yeah, Joel, I'll let you, if you want to answer that.
Integrity is a virtue. It's something to reach towards. When you have someone in business, and I'll give you an example of Roy's business as an example of his integrity. In the coffee business at the turn of the century, people would often misrepresent where the coffee beans came from. And they would claim they came from one plantation, which would generate a higher cost than another plantation. They would change the weight of the coffee bags, and they'd actually put other things in the coffee bags, a stove, a pipe, other things to change the weight of the bag. So there's a lot of dishonesty. At that early time in history, a board of arbitration was set up for the coffee industry, and Roy was one of the founding members, and he was considered a taster. And this was touched on earlier, where he could tell from the coffee bean where it came from, which plantation it came from. So instead of the coffee importers killing each other or getting into physical fights, there would be an arbitration board. This was an example of his integrity. People trusted him so much that they believed it, which was true, when he told them where the bean came from. Integrity you can talk about, but it helps to have concrete examples of it. That's one example, how well he was trusted. He was trusted by Abdu'l-Bahá to read every document that was sent to the United States, and he would send it off to the believers. So he was able to read every document that was sent to every believer because he was so trusted. These are just two examples of his integrity, how the central figures of the faith trusted him so much.
And you have to remember that many of the people writing to Abdu'l-Bahá and Shoghi Effendi are writing about personal problems. So he saw all that, the coming through. But the other aspect of this is forthrightness. He doesn't say things that aren't true. And this is something you find when you study a lot of hands of the cause. They're often described as frank. And because they don't know how to tell you something that's not true. This is not who they are. So if they don't like your sweater, they'll tell you they don't like your sweater. May Maxwell's a great example of that. But he was quiet, so he wouldn't say things that were hurtful, but he was always very frank and forthright with people. That's part of integrity. And the other aspect of his personality that we didn't touch on as much as we should was obedience. Instant obedience. He didn't quibble. I mean, if Shoghi Effendi said, do this, then there's no question about it. It's only how fast can I do it? So he had his staff trained in his office that when something came in, he was to be from Shoghi Effendi or Abdu'l-Bahá, he was to be notified immediately. If there was action to be taken, they dropped what they were doing and they took care of it instantly. And this is, he didn't have any, he couldn't understand why other Baha'is didn't operate the same way. One of the big things that bothered a lot of Baha'is was when Shoghi Effendi reaffirmed and Abdu'l-Bahá reaffirmed the review process, that you couldn't publish anything without going through proper review. And he couldn't understand why people weren't instantly obedient to that. What was the problem? It came from Abdu'l-Bahá or Shoghi Effendi. Why was there a problem? You just do it, So this was also why he was so trusted, was instant obedience. Comes from the head of the faith. That's all he needs to know. You need money. How do I get that money? There were times where the amount needed was more than he could come up with out of his own pocket or out of the funds. And he would turn to a couple of other people like Fred Schafflacher, who was an industrialist, a wealthy industrialist, or Amelia Collins or whatever, to help him out, to make sure that what was needed was taken care of instantly. Often when, this is why we mentioned the land in the Holy Land. That property bought after he died was just one example, but after World War I, Jews were coming in very rapidly to the Holy Land, particularly in the years leading up to World War II, when they were escaping the anti-Semitism of Europe and Russia. And so Haifa was developing very rapidly. Apartment buildings were going up right and left. And they were encroaching on land that was strategic to the Shrine of the Bab in particular, and the future terraces and so forth. And so sometimes to get the land that he needed, he had to have the money instantly. Shoghi Effendi knew that if he went to Roy and said, I need this money now, that Roy would move heaven and earth, whether it was coming from the National Fund or his own pocket, and often it's a combination, to make that happen. And there were many times that he opened his own pocket and made up the difference. Particularly once we started having full-time staff when the national office in 1939 was moved to Wilmette, they often couldn't make the payroll or couldn't pay for the utility bills or whatever. And he just pull it out of his own pocket if the fund didn't have the money. So, and the other thing about that is, here is someone who's very wealthy, but he doesn't live like he's wealthy. He's always frugal because he wants his money to go to the faith. I mean, his home in Maine, he built himself out of logs from the property. I mean, this is, he wasn't a fancy dresser. He did like nice cars, but he usually bought them used. So anyway, he was very frugal with himself.
One example of the frugality, when he would mail a letter to somebody, he would pad it with newspaper clippings so that it would weigh exactly an ounce, so that he would get his full value out of the nickel or whatever the postage was at that time. He didn't want to have something less than an ounce to be mailed for the price.
Right, right.
But another example of his instant obedience, towards the end of his life, when the International Archives was being built, so he was ill in Maine, already retired from the National Spiritual Assembly, he gets a cable from Shoghi Effendi asking for some curtains, which they plan to use to put in the archives building. So Roy immediately contacts a woman in Chicago who can provide it. And then he sends one of his staff, not to the local cablegram place, but one about 20 something miles away, so that the cable would get there quicker to Shoghi Effendi, so he wouldn't have to wait for a slower cable. This is at the end of his life when he's already ill. He's still to that level of care and detail. We believe that Roy Wilhelm was the second person in the West to have Hukuk law accepted.
The first was Louis Getzinger. Yeah.
Well, Blackwell.
I'd always read Lua, but anyway, that's all right. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
Well, nonetheless, this is amazing stuff to be able to glean from in this presentation. And actually, I want to ask, because we have a member of the audience, Alex, he asked an excellent question. And if you give me you just give me a moment. Let me pull his question. It says, what was his goal in life before and after his faith? So Roy Wilhelm, what was his goal in life before and after his faith?
Gary said goats, but
goats.
He loved goats. He had a big goat herd in Maine, and he had goats in his property in New Jersey, but that's a whole nother fun story. But
it's amazing. So Roy Wilhelm actually liked goats. Like, that's something I would not have known had you guys not told me.
Yeah. He loved goats. And John Bosch was the one who was a Swiss from Switzerland, had introduced Roy to a particular type of goat. that was known for producing a lot of milk and so forth. And so he had a small number there on his property in New Jersey, and then he had a large herd on his main property,
Like
but 300 or so. But Roy, I think, was just a young man who wanted to be successful in life. I think he must have, the idea of accumulating wealth must have been attractive to him, because he also, we know when he was a traveling salesman as a teenager, he had accumulated a pretty good piggy bank of money, and then he got swindled out of it. So that made him always cautious about not being swindled again. But the fact that he had actually accumulated a nest egg as a teenager, as a traveling salesman, shows that having a nest egg was important to him.
But you also have to realize that he did not finish high school. Gary talked about his father having a college education. He did not finish high school, even though he became this very successful businessman. But after declaring his belief in Baha'u'llah, I believe his mission was to be of service to the cause.
Right.
And he did it supporting pioneers. He did it in so many different ways. His instant obedience, I believe that was his goal in life, but to use his wealth to accomplish that.
And it was important to Abdu'l-Bahá that he be successful with his business, because we need people with wealth, and he's sort of the patron saint of Baha'i businessmen among the hands in many ways. He wanted to travel west with Abdu'l-Bahá, and Abdu'l-Bahá writes to him and says, no, I want you to go back to New York and work in your office. You've hung out with me long enough. You're neglecting your business. You need to go back and deal with your business. And then later, just before World War I, he wanted to keep traveling around the country to teach the faith. And he said, no, I want your station is at your office in New York. That's where I need you. And at the end of World War I, the coffee business just went off like a rocket. He was allowed to start traveling again, but he, particularly in the 1920s, made a lot of his wealth then. Someone, Hebe Struven, who was Louis Gessinger's sister, and she became very important to Roy in the last years of her life. She and her husband sort of took care of Roy at the main home. She said that if you compared Henry Randall and Roy, both of them were successful entrepreneurs, but Henry sort of let his business go. He didn't pay close attention to it and ended up losing his wealth, whereas Roy continued to take care of his business and became very wealthy. But the wealth was for the faith. And, he was very clear about that. Abdu'l-Bahá also one time talked to Roy privately while he was in Chicago with Abdu'l-Bahá, and warned him that when Baha'is came looking to other Baha'is for financial assistance when they were in financial bad shape, that those people should be referred to institutions. They shouldn't be, individuals shouldn't deal with them.
Institutions meaning?
The Baha'i institutions, the assembly, well, they didn't call them assemblies at the time, but the local governing bodies or the Temple Unity or whatever, they shouldn't be handled by individuals. They should be handled by that. So, and certainly plenty of people did ask him for help, but he learned from Abdu'l-Bahá that no, that was an institutional issue, not a individual person with means issue.
And just to give you another teaser, we didn't talk at all during this hour plus about his race unity work.
Oh, yes, very important.
So that will be a reason to buy the book.
Right.
Or him as a spy.
Being accused of a spy, as being a German spy in World War II. But yeah, no, he and Louis Gregory were very close, and he did everything he possibly could to promote race amity. Was very.
You mentioned Martha Root and you mentioned Louis Gregory, actually, earlier in this talk. So you're mentioning Louis Gregory, Martha Root, and we also mentioned his aspects of course, when people came to him, he said, let's go through the institutions. What was different about his treatment of Martha Root and Louis Gregory in terms of funding their teaching initiatives? What was different about it?
Well, Martha insisted that he not deputize her. And she wanted to pay her own way. So she tried to earn her own keep by selling her articles to newspapers and journals as she traveled around the world. And she also had a modest inheritance. But there were a few times where she got in trouble and suddenly needed funds and didn't have them. And so he had to get money to her in those situations. And the National Assembly also was prepared to give her money. So sometimes he was doing it out of his own pocket. Sometimes he was doing it on behalf of the National Assembly. Like, for example, when she's dying in Hawaii, Shoghi Effendi, first of all, he let the Baha'is in Honolulu know that if they needed any money, he would send it. But Shoghi Effendi sent money to help her out. And he was the conduit through which that money got to the Honolulu Baha'is. It was used to help pay for her. It didn't get there in time to help with her medical expenses, but it paid for her gravestone. So sometimes he's acting that way and sometimes he's acting the other way. I don't know how much he financially helped Louis Gregory. I'm sure he probably did, but he also treated Louis completely as a dear friend and equal, and he was always welcome to stay at his home in New Jersey and then in Maine. And for example, Louis got arrested for riding in a car on a train he wasn't supposed to be on. When the train had left Chicago, it was legal for him to be in the Pullman car there, but when he got to Tennessee, it wasn't legal for him to be, or Kentucky. He gets pulled off the train and spends a night in jail. And Roy writes a letter to the judge afterwards to sort of shore up Louis Gregory in that, and to bring home to the judge what a saintly man they had done this to and how unfair it was, but the judge had been fair by releasing him. But anyway, so he serves as an advocate. He's one of the promoters of the Race Amity conferences. In fact, the Boston Race Amity Conference, he serves as the reporter that sends the report to the Star of the West on the Boston Race Amity Conference in 1922 or 21. But so, you know, I'm sure he slipped some money to Louis, but from time to time, but he also understood that they had to have, that this was their service. And like Martha wanted to fund her own service. And he respected that.
But in addition, when you looked at some of those pictures of the souvenir picnic from 1912, 1919, 1926, some of the ones that were shown in the slideshow, you noticed a large number of African-American believers who were present. How many Americans during World War I, or that time period, would have a diversity of races invited to their house?
Right.
That was bizarrely rare.
Yeah.
The number of lynchings in this country reached their peak in the teens. And here Roy has his house open to all people. That's just one more example.
Well, in fact, when Roy's father died, there was an African-American minister who was associated with the faith, and he was the one who conducted the graveside service for his father. So you can imagine the neighbors and other people who showed up for Otis Wilhelm's funeral, and here's this Black minister conducting the funeral. You know, this is Roy.
Even in the present day, during the souvenir picnic, the days before, the local Baha'i community goes to the neighbors to invite them to the picnic and tell them what's going to happen. So you can imagine this process going on in the 1910s and 20s and 30s with all these diverse people showing up in this very white town. Teaneck is now diverse, but at that time it was not. Explaining who all these people are that are going to be on the property right next to your house.
This is amazing. Thank you so much for having shared so much of these insights that you've been able to gather. And I know that as we're talking about your book as well, and that it's going to be published, there is a question that Regina has asked, and very simple: where can we purchase this book? Is it available through the Bahá'í distribution service?
The U.S. Baha'i Publishing Trust is the one that is quite anxious and committed to publishing this book. So they will be the ones who will publish it, and it will be announced in the American Bahá'í and on their website and so forth when it's available. We're hoping by this summer. We have one wild card that may affect how fast it can come out, but we hope that it should be with the editor in the next couple of weeks, and then we'll see how fast they're able to work through that. So anyway, God willing, it'll be ready for the picnic. That's what we're hoping for at the end of June. And the other plug for the Horace Howley book is it's pretty much done printing. I think anyone who listens to this in Europe will know that it should be available in Europe in the next couple of weeks. And hopefully by April, it will be ready for distribution through the Baha'i distribution service in the US. And then usually there's a lag time, and then it's available. These books should be available on Amazon.
Okay. Yeah, thank you for sharing all this. This is very valuable for those of us who don't know where to purchase the book. Now we have an idea where to go. The Baha'i distribution service is available for everyone to go online and purchase. And I forgot the name of the website, actually. I think it's Baha'i Bookstore, was it? .com?
Yeah. Right.
Beautiful.
Right. Yeah. So
with that,
like I said, it will be also featured in the American Baha'i as well. So when it's available.
And the American Baha'i, for those of you watching, is a magazine that you get when you're in the United States. The magazine is sent to your home if you provide your address and you sign up as a member of the Baha'i faith to receive these newsletters. You receive them, I believe it's semi-annual. No, it's quarterly, correct?
4 times a year.
4 times a year, quarterly. Yes. I don't know, I was going to say quarterly. So that being said, it is almost time for the ending of our beautiful session. And I wanted to ask if there are any final remarks that we think we should put out before we conclude for the afternoon.
Is someone talking that we can't hear?
Oh, I hear a background sound as well. Let's see. Nope. I just looked. Nope. That was just background sound in one of the speakers.
One of the last things I want to say is that, the quote from the Bible that Abdu'l-Bahá used a number of times, and so did Shoghi Effendi, about it's harder for a rich man to go through the eye of a needle, which is actually a gate in Jerusalem, than for a camel for a rich man to go through the eye of a needle than for a camel to go through the eye of the needle. I've screwed that all up. I'm trying to do it from memory. A camel could go through that gate, but it had to go in a humble way on its belly to get through that gate. But it's always been mentioned in scripture, including in Baha'i scripture, how difficult it is for a person who has material wealth to attain high spiritual status. But it says that when someone who is materially wealthy attains high spiritual status, that gives them an added aspect to their spirituality. And it adds to their spiritual station. And I think that the fact that Roy is an example of someone who did not allow his material affluence to impede his spiritual development is an extremely important thing. We have a few other hands of the cause that we can look to who were also wealthy. I mean, Amelia Collins comes to mind, Fred Schafflacher, for example. I know one of the she wasn't a hand, Phoebe Hearst, but the one of the 4 hands appointed by Baha'u'llah was very wealthy. So I think that we have to remember that this is another big hurdle he jumped over, and that people who are in the business community can look at Roy and see the integrity of his life and how he used his connections that he made through business, his wealth he made through business, and he made it a tool for the betterment of mankind. And so he's a wonderful example on many, many levels of a saintly person, and someone that I think we can all use to inspire us.
But you can also think of wealth. Oftentimes in modern times, you think of people who give away money as having lots of strings or conditions applied to it. And when Abdu'l-Bahá or Shoghi Effendi asked Roy for something, there's no string. It's not, if this, I'll do that sort of comment. It's that instant obedience. So if you think of people applying for a grant, you know, I applied for a grant when I was in college for research for $100,000. The grant application took about 50 pages. It was unbelievable. They wanted my life story and everything else. Roy doesn't do any of that. His was this unconditional instant obedience to use his wealth. And he didn't give it to everybody. We have examples of people asking him for money, which he did not give them. But when the central figures of the faith asked, it was totally unrestrained.
One time he even took out a big loan in order to get the money to the World Center. And he didn't tell Shoghi, he couldn't pay for it all himself. He took out a loan, and he didn't ever let, I think it was Shoghi Effendi, know that he had to do that.
Abdu'l-Bahá, I think, yeah.
Yeah, or Abdu'l-Bahá. So anyway, but although they probably didn't.
Astounding.
Yeah.
Astounding. Thank you so much for having been describing all of this in such detail today, giving us a foretaste of this very intriguing book that you've been able to work together to produce. And really, for those of us watching and those of us future businessmen out there and businesswomen out there that are looking at this is something definitely for inspiration for all of us. It's definitely inspiring to me. I really appreciate this presentation, and I hope that we can have you all to come here and present more on these amazing subjects. That being said, we do have to close for today, and we deeply appreciate, we're very humbled by this story, and we deeply appreciate your time. For those of you who are joining us, this is your first time watching. This is on clearwaterbaha'is.org. You can join on the Zoom sessions, and more importantly, share these videos on YouTube and on Facebook. Clearwater Bahá'ís on YouTube and the Bahá'í Center of Clearwater on Facebook. With that being said, we wish you all a wonderful afternoon. Thank you all for joining. And until next time, next week at 11 a.m. on Sunday.